Richard Burr. Thank you. Keith, thank you for that very kind introduction. President Tony. Boy, you say that everywhere around this place, don't you? Thank you for the invite to be here, and I look at this as an opportunity to at least free you for 1 hour a day from having to watch those damn ads on TV. I'll talk a little bit about the elections, but not much. And let me just say this: if I pull out these glasses, which I'm going to, you've never seen me use glasses. I got a slight eye infection this weekend that I've been dealing with. I found out how it was to drive from Winston-Salem with one eye open on 77 today. Because if I opened two of them, it looked like I was taking both lanes. This is a fascinating year, and typically I'd come in front of you to talk about what the Congress had accomplished in the last year and forecast for you what they were going to accomplish in the next year. Well, that's really easy. 0 in the last year, and I have no clue what we're going to take up for the next year, in large measure because it's going to be dictated by 2 weeks from today. But let me, if I could, very quickly focus on a couple of issues that I think are of importance today. The first one, ISIL, or ISIS as the national media refers to it. I think there's a lack of understanding by the American people and certainly around the globe as to what the threat is here. And let me just suggest to you that this is a group of individuals who control more weapons, control more geography, and have more money than any terrorist organization in the history of the world. I'm not sure you need to say more than that to suggest that it's a threat to the United States, it's a threat to Europe, it's a threat to Asia, it's a threat to any country in the world. It just so happens that from a standpoint of their red area of the bullseye that they look at, it's Europe, it's the United States, it's Canada. Now, I can't with any great assurance tell you that there is an attack that's planned 3 weeks from Wednesday, but I can tell you that that organization spends some portion of every day trying to figure out how to recruit individuals that can find their way back into Europe easily or back into the United States to carry out acts. I've had the fortune or misfortune to serve on the Intelligence Committee since in the House or the Senate since 2000. So when you look at it from a standpoint of number of years, when Saxby Chambliss leaves and retires this year, I'll have more years on the committee, House and Senate, than any other member of the Congress. And that gives me a historical perspective. History can be defined in 14 years. But I think that 2001 was a distinct change in terrorism as it related to global terrorism and certainly here at home. And I think when I look at the perspective that I put on ISIL, it really does go at the heart of what we feared most after 9/11. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at terrorists using aircraft to fly into buildings. Our biggest worry was that they would dumb it down to where they would go after easy targets. And what ISIL has realized is that one individual with access can create enough fear to basically stop a global economy. And when you realize that for most of the radical Muslims, their fear is the Western influence on their society, then you realize that the global economy is a huge target for disruption because it insulates them from that Western influence. And it doesn't matter whether you talk about ISIL or Khorasan, or for that fact, when ISIL's gone, there will be another one. The only thing I'll add to this is I don't want any person here to believe that this will be over in a year or 2 years or 5 years. This is a battle I predict that the world will fight for at least 4 or 5 decades. This has a generational staying power unlike anything I've ever seen. Whether it's right that we've contributed to fueling that, I've got to tell you that I have no other option other than to eliminate the threat. And that's to use whatever means we, the Europeans, our partners around the world, can bring to the fight. And the truth is that I have been publicly critical because for a year and a half I've felt like the United States should be engaged in the genocide that existed in Syria between Assad and the Syrian people. Had we in fact exercised a no-fly zone or certain parameters to that fight earlier on, I don't think today that ISIL would be in Iraq. I don't think we'd be fighting a two-front conflict. I think it would be contained, but it wouldn't be eliminated. Elimination is going to be a decision that leaders around the world, including here, will have to make because it will involve boots on the ground. And it's just a question of whether elimination of these threats is vital to global security and, more importantly, to economic security around the world. Ebola is a name we've heard about. It's not something that we were associated very closely with. It's only 37 years old from the standpoint of infectious diseases that we've known about it. Its outbreaks predominantly in Western Africa up till this point were in small villages. They contained a village. It burned itself out in a very small population. Its history is a morbidity rate of about 50%, and I'm not sure that we've seen anything change. The difference in this current outbreak is that it hit populated areas. It hit areas that it was more difficult to contain, and the World Health Organization basically fell down on the first day. I think if you look back at what the UN has done, they've almost cut the World Health Organization's budget in half. They have no rapid response capabilities. And what you find in West Africa is that you have no healthcare infrastructure. It was a perfect storm. I think that when you look at the United States, everything that you've heard, even though I think the administration has done a pitiful job at communicating to the American people about, one, the infectious disease, and two, our capabilities here. Make no mistake about it, with the health infrastructure that we have in the United States, we can treat, we can contain. It could never be an epidemic or an outbreak in the United States. We are that good. And the fact is that we've seen that we weren't very well prepared for what the CDC undertook. We should have known what the right procedures were for this and any other infectious disease long before we started putting out guidelines, whether it was for Dallas or whether it might have been for Charlotte. And the reality is that this is a wake-up call for the public entities, but it also tells us that we could be great in the federal government, which we're not. And I think that's no surprise to you. But if we haven't got a partnership that makes our state partners and our local partners every bit as good, then we fail. And there's the message out of this, that from everything we're going to learn over the continuation of this outbreak, we've got to have a public health infrastructure in this country that connects at a state and local level in a real and impactful way. And I think for certain institutions that already exist, but let me just give you an example. As we made the announcements of what the federal government was going to do in West Africa, we're now 6 weeks past the president telling the American people we're going to stand up 10 field hospitals, there are going to be 1,700 beds, we're sending 3,000 troops to West Africa, and we're sending the commissioned corps of healthcare workers from the United States there to support those healthcare workers in West Africa. Today, 6 weeks later, we have one field hospital up, 170 beds. We've got 9 more to set up. The deployment notices went out the 1st of October to engineers at Fort Bragg and other military installations with a deployment date of the end of October. It means it's the 1st of November before they're on site looking at site preparation, much less construction of beds. Now this is where the disconnect comes from. Our response is not consistent with the explosion in the infection rate. The World Health Organization estimates by the second week of December, the new infection rate of Ebola in three countries in Africa could be 10,000 people a week. As of right now, we've had 10,000 infections and just over 5,000 deaths. Again, morbidity rate of about 50%. But we also have an underreporting of infections, we think, of somewhere between 4 and a multiplier of 4 or 5. So in all likelihood, there's 40 to 50,000 infected lives in three countries, and we've probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 deaths. That's dead bodies that have yet to be found that probably were still infectious for a number of days thereafter, and family members who have looked at the success rate of the clinics there and found you go there to die, and chosen not to go to a clinic. Individuals that were taken to clinics and turned away because the clinics were full, who traveled there in the back seat of a taxi, throwing up. How did the NBC reporter get infected? He was helping clean up a vehicle. And it was that vehicle, we think, that caused the infection. These are all things that can't happen in the United States of America. Probably wouldn't happen in most of Europe. But the reality is that everything changes if, in fact, you have an infection rate of 10,000 new infected patients a week. The threat becomes more and more real to the rest of the world. And that's why I called on the administration to every 2 weeks update, in fact, what we plan to do. I'm not one that's called for a travel ban, but I have called for a reassessment of everything that we've got in place. And with that, it might mean 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now, if we get to an infection rate of 10,000, then a travel ban might be the only option that we have to assure the American people that this is not going to be a disruption, at least in the U.S. economy. Now, let me say as a side note to this, Ebola and terrorism are connected. Basically, what you're going to have is three countries in West Africa where their healthcare system is decimated. Their economy is gone. Their government has no credibility. Their elected representatives, as soon as this is over, will be run out of their countries. And you will have a generation starved for a paycheck. And you'll probably have terrorist organizations looking for safe havens. These three countries will be ripe for terrorists to find a home where they can pay individuals who have lived to become part of their organizations, and they will find this very reasonable from a standpoint of the price compared to what they're paying people in Syria today on the front lines of the battlefield. And that's the other reason I tell you that this is a 4 or 5 decade process that we will go through in this country, because we have to educate a generation that has yet to be born that this is not what our religion believes. And it's not something that we can do by ourselves from the United States. So there are two issues that I think are of great importance. If it's not for national security, then it's for economic security, and will continue to play out, I think, well past the end of this administration. So I think that they will be issues that probably are at the forefront of the 2016 presidential race. Now, the last thing that I'd like to talk about, just very briefly, are the Senate races around the country. Well, why $100 million in North Carolina? You know what that does to somebody who's up in 2016? Do you know how many people are not going to take my phone call next year? For whatever reason, North Carolina was picked to be the bullseye of the target. It was picked to be the firewall of this election cycle. Right or wrong, and I can tell you that there are no numbers there from a standpoint of polling or anything that would say this is the right place. I could have made the case that Louisiana probably was a better place, but they don't consider it to be part of the South for some reason. But here's where we are today. In my estimation, there are currently 10 or 11 seats in play in the United States Senate. And I'm making one big assumption that Mitch McConnell is going to win in Kentucky, that Pat Roberts is going to win in Kansas, and that David Perdue is going to win in Georgia. And I think when you see the prevailing winds, it's hard for me to believe that in Kansas, where they haven't elected a Democrat to the United States Senate since Truman, that all of a sudden they're going to choose to do it this year. In a state like Georgia, I don't believe that Georgia is all of a sudden going to go Democrat when you look at the outcome of the last presidential race in the state of Georgia. And in Kentucky, I don't think Kentucky has any intentions of turning a minority leader who would be a majority leader out to pasture, even though it's a good horse state. I think they see that as an advantage. When you get past those three, you've got 3 seats that are already over: West Virginia, South Dakota, and Montana. Those are 3 states that I will assure you are going to switch from Democrats to Republicans. So that leaves you with the next 3 states, which are the 3 battleground states: North Carolina, Arkansas, Louisiana. You begin to run into some tricky things as you talk about Louisiana, because Louisiana is a free-for-all 2 weeks from Tuesday. Every candidate's on the ballot. The top 2 vote getters then go to a runoff on December the 5th. So it's a 4-week sprint in between the general election for everybody else and a runoff in Louisiana. If you look at polling today, Mary Landrieu wins the race 2 weeks from today, 45-43 or some margin about like that. But when she gets to December, she's defeated by Bill Cassidy, an MD, by right now the margin's 9 points. And that's what happens when you take the top 3 vote getters, and the third one is in fact a Republican as well. So I would make the case to you today: Arkansas is already over. Louisiana just has to play out, but it's over. And if your math is good, we held 3, we picked up 3, we've now got 2, and everybody's looking at North Carolina. But here's what's changed. Nobody envisioned that Alaska would be resolved this early. They thought it would probably come down to the wire. By every poll in the last 3 weeks, and by the real clear politics, you see Dan Sullivan, the Attorney General, with a commanding lead over Mark Begich. That race is over with. So I think I can correctly suggest to you today that the majority of the minority are going to switch. It's a question about how much. But I think that Alaska now tips it over the top. All of a sudden, you've got 2 states that one wouldn't have suggested without the right candidate would be in play: Colorado and Iowa. I'm not sure how Iowa's going to turn out, but you got to give a lot of credit to Joni Ernst. If she can castrate a pig, she can run for the Senate. I sort of welcome somebody with that skill in that institution. If you strictly went on where those races are today, Republicans will win Iowa and they will win Colorado. And I do believe, with what I've seen in the last 24 hours, Colorado is now over with. That will switch hands. Mark Udall will lose that race. So all of a sudden we just went from 6 to likely 8. Then you ask me where is 9 and 10? New Hampshire. Scott Brown running against Gene Shaheen, the former governor, who's been in the Senate for 6 years. That's a 2-point race. It will be a 2-point race right up until the day of the election. New Hampshire, I learned when I campaigned vigorously for John McCain. You might remember John McCain didn't play in Iowa. Came out of Iowa, everybody said he was dead. I remember he called me from New Hampshire the next day. He'd done his first town hall meeting. He said, it was great. I said, well, how many people there were there, John? He said, 4. I remember going to bed that night saying, oh God, he doesn't have a chance. He did 104 town hall meetings over the next several weeks, getting ready for the New Hampshire primary. And he called me the night of the last town hall meeting that he did, because I was flying up for the primary. And I said, John, how many people were there? He said, Richard, they were hanging out the windows. New Hampshire is a state where retail politics still works. And Scott Brown is probably one of the best retail politicians I've ever seen. So it's going to be very interesting. Either the state's no longer a state where retail politics plays, or the winds just aren't blowing up there the way they are in some other states. But that'll be one that you'll watch right down to the wire. The one to watch, as far as my surprise races, if you see this wave, as the national talking heads call it, happen, I would tell you the surprise may be Michigan. Terry Lynn Land, the former Secretary of State, running against Peters, who's a House member. It's interesting to me that you could have a state where every statewide office is held by a Republican, and all of a sudden you have an open Senate seat, and a Republican doesn't win it. She hadn't run a great campaign. She has raised a tremendous amount of money. I've found her as an individual, when I've been up with her, that would be refreshing to the United States Senate, because she says what she means and she means what she says. But that's a long shot on Election Day. You might have caught the fact that I didn't handicap North Carolina for you. Well, there's a reason. That's for you to do. It's for voters in North Carolina to decide the outcome of this race. It's not for me to forecast. I've certainly been out campaigning for John Jones. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. And it gets to the heart of the prayer. Participation is absolutely vital to the election process. And when he said that we're a 238-year experiment in democracy, let me assure you, we're still an experiment. I never will forget the day that I was sitting in my office, and a major who flew F-15s from Seymour Johnson walked in my office. I'd never met him, a colonel, excuse me, and said he needed to see me, but he had something to give me, and he walked in and he gave me a ballot from the Iraqi elections. And he said, Senator, when I landed that day, I was doing air patrol over one of the polling places. He said, the polling official in charge of that place came over and handed me that ballot. He said, would you give this to the person who's the reason you're here? Because this was vital to my first ability in my lifetime to vote. And he said, the first thing I thought about was you. And that hangs proudly in my front office. But you remember it just like I do, how proud people were to have a purple finger. These people walked through gunfire to go to polling places. We can vote for 10 days before the election. In Colorado and Oregon, they vote by mail. And most employers will give you the day off, and if you can't, you can get there early in the morning or late at night. Politicians don't want to skew voter turnout, trust me. Because we all know the more people vote, the more likely we are to elect the right person. But if we want to take the word experiment out of this 238-year experience we've gone through, then we've got to get better than 52% in an off year and 72% in a presidential election. I mean, it is almost embarrassing. The fact is that the outcome of our election is why we are the economic gorilla in the world. It's because when you make an investment in this country, you know the government's in place for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. There's nothing that can happen that all of a sudden forces a coalition to crumble and a special election to be called in 90 days. That's everybody else in the rest of the world, not us. Our ability to attract global capital, to create jobs, to make investments in the next generation is based upon the certainty that our elections bring. And I would suggest to you this, the rule of law and the protection of intellectual property, which nobody else does. It allows us to innovate. And as long as you can innovate, you're going to be the market leader. I would suggest to you that this is all sort of wrapped up together. And you can't be the economic leader, and you can't be the gold standard of certainty in elections and choose when you leave. whether it's in Syria, whether it's in West Africa with Ebola, regardless of where it is in the world. With that role that we play comes a responsibility. And if we pass it up, that vacuum will get filled, probably in a way that's not good for our future or for the world. So I'm here today to give you that quick update, to reinforce the prayer today. Vote and get as many people as you can to go out and do the same. But also to tell you, don't give up on this country. Don't look at one administration or one decade and what we've gone through or the challenges since 2008 domestically. You realize that the United States of America is the third largest exporter of textiles? Would you believe that in North Carolina? The third largest exporter in the world. Most people in this country think that every textile job has left. No, there are 500,000 textile workers in America. And if we keep energy low, we're going to have 1 million textile workers in 10 years. And furniture is going to be back. I never thought I'd stand in front of a crowd and tell you it's cheaper to manufacture in the United States than it is anywhere else in the rest of the world, but it is right now. And it's primarily because of energy. Imagine what we could accomplish if we drive energy even lower and we match that with corporate tax rates in this country that are competitive with the rest of the world. It would absolutely be the biggest magnet for global capital to come here. I want to thank you for the opportunity. I've left myself only time for one question. Based upon the guy to my side, 2 questions.